All right, I am live. Welcome back from the Faulty Council, Mike. We're going to talk about the word Easter today as it appears in the King James Bible. Acts chapter 12 and verse 14. So get your Bible, get it ready. I'm going to be sharing it also on the screen. This is probably the most talked about, quote-unquote, mistranslation in the King James Bible. That's really kind of the lightning rod passage, is the fact that the King James Bible uses the word Easter in Acts chapter 12, verse 4, when Herod is about to kill Peter, and that the manuscripts don't have the word Easter in there, that they have the word Passover. And so Easter should not have been translated Easter, but should have been translated Passover. And usually people who want to prove that there's something wrong with the King James Bible, it tends to be the most obvious line of attack. So that's where they're going to go. By the way, I don't know if this thing is working. If you can let me know, that'd be great, because I'm not sure the audio is on. It should be okay. Did I connect? Let's see, just to make sure. Yeah. All right. Seems like we're good. So I'll show you the passage in question here. And if you want to join in, because I invited you to join in, I'm going to put that the link in the chat. Et voila. And we're going to go pin it at the top of the channel. Give me a second, guys. Give people some time to come in, Lord willing. Oh, thank you, Joseph. I'm glad you can hear me. All right, so it's pinned. So let's get into it. Here we go. So there's Acts chapter 12. And now about that time, Herod the king stretched forth his hands to vex certain of the church. And he killed James, the brother of John, with a sword. And because he saw it pleased the Jews, he proceeded further to take Peter also. Then were the days of unleavened bread. And when he had apprehended him, he put him in prison and delivered him to 4 quaternions of soldiers, 4 times 4, to keep him, intending after Easter to bring him forth to the people. There it is. This is Easter time. It's Resurrection Sunday time. It's Passover time. And inevitably, we're going to get into the controversy of, should you say Happy Easter? Should you use the word Easter? Is the word Easter the pagan god Astarte, Eostre, in connection to the eggs that the rabbits bring, in connection to fertility and revival in springtime? Is it a heathen word that's been Christianized? Or is it a valid Christian word? Right? Or, as the KJVO defense is, no, it's a valid word. It is a heathen holiday. That's precisely the point, that it's pointing to a holiday different than the Passover, which is kind of the KJVO line that I also had espoused for years. But I'm going to show you today why I agree that Easter is fine. I don't count that as a mistake in the King James Bible. I'm happy to say Happy Easter, but it's not. But the defense for the word Easter that KJVOs have is an erroneous defense. I suggest a better line of defense, which I believe is the truth, and it's therefore better to uphold the text of the King James Bible. Okay, that's where I'm going with this today. So I'll show you a little bit what the translations, the commentators, forgive me, are going to say about this. And one thing you noticed after you study, I read a ton of commentators, a ton, and after a while you just start noticing that Peter Ruckman used to say that one jackass copies the another. Ass just means donkey, and I don't mean to insult those commentators, but I'm focusing on the fact that commentators copy each other, and you're gonna notice that they copy each other really down to the words. It's kind of funny. Here, let me share the screen with you, and I'll show you some examples. This is Adam Clark commenting on the passage. Look at this. It's funny stuff. So Adam Clark in 1762, 1832, he's going to say, after the Passover, not Easter. Perhaps there never was a more unhappy, not to say absurd, translation than that in our text. So the worst mistranslation in the King James Bible the worst mistake in the King James Bible is the word Easter, according to the Methodist Adam Clarke in the 18th century. Now, what? It's funny. Look at this. Here is Albert Barnes, a Presbyterian, a few years after him in 1798 to 1870. So he publishes that between 47 and 85. He says, there never was a more absurd or unhappy translation than this. It really sounds like Albert Barnes just copied Adam Clarke over here. And then you go from Barnes in 1850 to Finis Dig, the Pentecostal, in 1902 to 1987. And he says, this is an unfortunate and absurd translation. So Dig copies Barnes, who copies Clarke. Let me verbatim. All right, so let's look into that. What's going on? So let me read you some of the commentators here. First of all, here's the first problem, first issue. The first issue is the manuscripts. There's no manuscript that says Easter. Now, last time I did my research on this was a few years ago. So I updated. I sat down yesterday on a couple of hours to work a little bit on it. Okay, so some of the stuff here might be dated, but as far as I remember, there is no manuscript, like at all, any kind of manuscript, any language, any family of manuscripts you care to name that says Easter. They all say Passover, Pascha, all of them. And so where in the world does Easter come from? It looks like the King James Bible guys just kind of teleported that thing into the text, right? Finding Narrative says, wow, talk about convergence. I'm preaching on this on Sunday. This Sunday, cool. All right. So this is a good example. Siggy says, Easter is a pagan feast like Christmas mixed with Bible truth, like the high places in the Old Testament where they worship. Have you ever asked the Lord how he sees this traditions? Of course, I've asked the Lord. That's a good question to ask. That's exactly why I'm doing a video about it, Siggy. So we're going to try to parse out, in my opinion, what is accurate here and what is not accurate. So the first issue is there is no word Easter in the manuscripts. It says Passover. So why do they say Easter? That's the first issue. The second issue is that one here that Siggy is mentioning, is that Easter is supposedly a pagan holiday. So let's read a little bit about that. Those are my notes on the book of Acts. Well, hopefully it'll be a book someday, like the book on Daniel. By the way, Daniel sold out on Amazon, out of print. One brother spoke. He said, I just bought one, and it was the last one. They're going to reprint them, but I thank God and I thank you guys. Okay? And if you're interested in my book on Daniel, it's in the description. The link is in the description. All right. So this is Adam Clarke. He says, the term Easter inserted here by our translators, they borrowed from the ancient Anglo-Saxon service books or from the version of the Gospels, which always translates to Pascha of the Greek by this term. So the Anglo-Saxon service books pre-King James had Easter in there. And Adam Clarke is saying the King James Bible translators based themselves on that. All right. Wycliffe used the word Pasque, Passover, but Tyndale, Coverdale, Beck, and Cardmartin, following the old Saxon mode of translation, insert Easter. So there are people who are doing it before the King James Bible translators. I'm just trying to get the background, the factual background behind this, so you can see how deep a dive I did in arriving at this video. The Geneva Bible very properly renders it the Passover, and I think that's fine. I don't think Passover is a mistake either. The Saxon Erten, Ertne, Ertno, Ertna, and Ertnen are different modes of spelling of the name of the goddess Easter, whose festival was celebrated by our pagan forefathers on the month of April. Hence, that month in the Saxon calendar is called Easter month. Every view we can take of the subject shows the gross impropriety of retaining a name every way exceptionable and palpably absurd. So this is kind of like really where most people are going to land on this. Even the King James Bible believers who defend the use of the word Easter believe this. I don't believe that. And I'll show you why in a few moments. But this is kind of where they land. Bollinger, Easter is a heathen term derived from the Saxon goddess Eastre, the same as Astarte, the Syrian Venus called Ashtoreth in the Old Testament. And then Dake writes about that too. He says, it is not a Christian name, but is derived from Ishtar, one of the Babylonian titles of an idol goddess, the Queen of Heaven. You'll notice there's no sourcing for these claims. That's interesting. So you want to keep that in the back of your mind. The Saxon goddess Eastre is the same as Astarte, the Syrian Venus called Ashtoreth in the Old Testament. It was the worship of this woman by Israel that was such an abomination to God. Round cakes imprinted with the sign of the cross were made at this festival, the sign being in the Babylonian mysteries, a sign of life. Easter eggs, which play a great part in this day's celebration, were common in all heathen nations. Yeah, that's more like 1600s from Germany. The fable of the egg declares, but although that's true, what he's saying, the fable of the egg declares that an egg of wondrous size fell from heaven into the river Euphrates. The fish rolled it to the bank, where a dove settled upon it and hatched it, and out came Astarte, or Ishtar, the goddess of Easter. Easter, Christmas, Lady Day, Lent, and other Babylonian festivals were all borrowed from this religion, were all observed centuries before Christ. None of them have any relationship to Christ or Christianity. And then there's Pastor Chuck Smith here, who in his commentary says, it says Easter year, and that's a King James translation. They did not know anything about Easter in the early church. I don't know what he means by that. The word in the Greek is the Passover after the time of unleavened bread. That is a little incorrect, although the King James Bible translators use the same line of argument. Defenders, forgive me, the KJVO'S. But because Easter takes place during Passover season, because Jesus was crucified at the time of Passover, he also rose again 3 days later. And so the Jewish Passover usually coincides closely with our Easter season. And because this was translated by the King James translators in 1600, and by this time this pagan celebration of Ashtar had invaded the church and was changed slightly to Easter instead of Ashtar, the King James translators just translated this word Easter because it does signify that same time of the year. I understand where he's coming from, kind of saying, but we're going to address this issue about Easter because the only source for this is actually the 7th or 8th century monk Bede in England. And then Alexander Hislop picks that up and the two Babylons, which like a lot of Bible believers have read, and then it becomes gospel from there. So before I get into the whole Easter Astarte thing, what I'd like to comment on is the defense that is employed by the King James Bible believers. I am one of them. So the defense goes like this. Yes, we agree that Easter is originally a pagan holiday, but that's precisely the point. It's that the Holy Spirit led the King James Bible translators to differentiate between two different feasts, the Passover Jewish feast and the days of unleavened bread, whose days were rolling at the time of the narrative in Acts chapter 12 while Peter's imprisoned. But Easter is precisely that. It is a heathen holiday, and Herod is waiting for that other holiday, which is a heathen one, namely Easter, so he can kill Peter thereafter. And so therefore, Easter is a heathen holiday, and yet it is the correct translation because it's the correct holiday. That is the line we take. So I'll read you. Let me put on my glasses, actually. Guys, I don't even know where I put on my glasses. No, I'll do it without the glasses. I got a big enough screen, thank God. So let's see. Let me show you Dr. Ruckman's commentary on this. And then we'll look at Sam Gibbs' commentary on that. So here's Ruckman. He says, the Holy Spirit has thrust himself into the AV Committee of 1611 and said, right, Easter was a Roman holiday which Herod observed as religiously as any Babylonian priest observed it 1,000 years before Christ was born. Okay, guys, that's not true. That's just, I love brother Dr. Ruckman. I think he was the greatest Bible teacher that ever lived. That's completely out of his hat. And we'll look into that later. The Feast of the Passover, there's no historical documentation of this. The Feast of the Passover matched this pagan feast every 4 years. And since Herod was a Roman, the Holy Spirit has pointed out for you the Catholic feast which Rome substituted for the Passover. This was the bone of contention between the eastern and western branches of the church before AD 800, and it was the bone of contention between the Anglos, who were converted under the preaching of Alban, Columba, and St. Pat, and the papal emissaries who invaded England under Augustine. The date of Easter was the center of this dispute. Since that time, Easter has been on Sunday every, again, technically not accurate. Dr. Ekman was great and a great reader of history, but accuracy was not his forte, especially when it came to stuff like that. You'll notice nothing is almost ever sourced. Since that time, Easter has been on Sunday every year to match the pagan day of celebration fixed for Ishtar, Astarte, and Ashtoreth, although the Passover dates would change from year to year. Again, no documentation. You see, the Holy Spirit didn't die after writing the original manuscripts. I agree. He knows church history a good bit better than the revision committees of 1881. Okay, well, great. Ignorance of the relationship between Easter and the Pascha is what prompted the outburst of indignation at verse 4. To those still ignorant of this bunny-colored day, the Holy Spirit has pointed out the Roman connection. Well, so the opponents of the word Easter, that they oppose it based on that connection. So they're very much aware of it. So here, I think it's an unwitting misrepresentation of the other side. You didn't really need the word Passover inserted anyway, for the words "the days of unleavened bread" occur in verse 3 to give you the Jewish designation. Easter is the Roman designation, and Herod was a Roman. John R. Rice's comment, therefore, that Easter was not known to anyone at this time is just some more of the same old balloon juice. Okay, we'll look into that. So this is Dr. Ruckman. So Robert D says, I think it is deliberately inspired this way for double multiple applications. So I believe that's often, the Holy Spirit often does that for the same reasons, Brother Robert. But here there's a very simple one. So here let's look at Brother Gibbs' defense of the word Easter in the King James Bible. And to be clear, I believe the word Easter is not a mistake. I don't believe it's a mistake. That's why I use Easter. That's why I've got a clear conscience saying Happy Easter. I just think our defense is mistaken. Our defense doesn't work. We need another kind of defense, which I'd like to present today. All right, so here's Brother Gibb, personal friend, great scholar, great example, but I disagree with his exposition, but I'm going to read it, and I'm going to read it in full, okay? It says, it must also be noted that whenever the Passover is mentioned in the New Testament, the reference is always to the meal to be eaten on the night of April 14th, not to the entire week. The days of unleavened bread are never referred to as the Passover. There is a reference in Luke 22 that Bible critics run to in order to refute this biblical truth. Now, I run to it, and I'm not a Bible critic. Now, the Feast of Unleavened Bread drew nigh, which is called the Passover. This is Luke 22:1. So that's kind of the counters that you can't, basically, our defense rests in usually the Passover is the night of the Passover. Feast of Unleavened Bread refers to the 7 days that follow the night of the Passover, 1 + 7 = 8. And so if the text says that then were the days of unleavened bread, then Passover had already passed. And so using the word Easter serves as a terminological distinctive between the Jewish Passover and the pagan Easter. Herod is awaiting the pagan Easter to thereafter slay Peter. That's a line, okay? However, you got Bible passages where the expression unleavened bread covers even the first night of the slaying of the Passover. And so that is what's brought out by Luke 22:1, and Dr. Gibb is trying to counter that objection to the word Easter. He says they like to believe this in reference to the entire period of 8 days. Well, it is, and we'll see that. And I believe it, and I uphold the text of the King James. The fallacy of hope of this the fallacy of this, I hope, is evident in two particulars. First and foremost, it is that such a supposition can only be arrived at because the critic wants to use his reference to prove an error in Acts 12:4. It cannot be proven by Scripture. Well, I use that reference to prove that Easter is correct in Acts 12:4. Yeah, whatever. I wouldn't start with that, but whatever. Secondly, the term Feast of Unleavened Bread can be applied to both the Passover, the 14th. I think he says and here, but he means or in the sense of or. Okay, so I'm going to put that in brackets so I don't misrepresent him, and I'll show you that he means or the days of unleavened bread, the 15th to the 21st, but never both simultaneously. He means, as he's going to clarify shortly. So here's the an example he gives in Acts 12. In Exodus 12:17, the term Feast of Unleavened Bread is applied only to the 14th, which says, "And ye shall observe the Feast of Unleavened Bread, for in this self-same day have I brought your armies out of the land of Egypt. Therefore ye shall ye observe this day in your generation by an ordinance forever." And what he's focusing on, I believe, is the fact that it says this day, this day. That's what he's focusing on. Let me put it in bold. And so that serves to highlight the distinction between the Passover night when the Passover is slain and then the rest of the days which are unleavened bread in his mind. In Leviticus 23:6, it's important to understand the arguments of people. In Leviticus 23:6, this term is used to describe the day starting with April 15th, so after the day of the Passover, right? And on the 15th day of the same month is the Feast of Unleavened Bread unto the Lord. 7 days ye must eat unleavened bread. Although the term Feast of Unleavened Bread can be used to describe either the Passover or, there's my proof, the days, that's what he meant, or the days following it, the term the days of unleavened bread are never applied to the holy day, to the whole thing, meaning they had killed Jesus during the day, and that's not true. They had killed Jesus during the days of unleavened bread immediately following the Passover. Well, okay, that is literally the most difficult chronological issue in the Bible. They had killed Jesus Christ, the Son of God, during the days of unleavened bread. They were also excited about Herod's murder of Stephen. Anyone knows that a mob possesses the courage to do violent acts during religious festivities, not after. And further, considering Herod's position as a Roman, we must remember that the Herods were well known for celebrating. In fact, okay, he kills a guy, he kills John the Baptist at his birthday. It's elementary to see that Herod in Acts 12 had arrested Peter during the days of unleavened bread after the Passover. The days of unleavened bread would end, I'm not sure how it says how after can be proven. The days of unleavened bread would end on the 21st of April. Shortly after that would come Herod's celebration of pagan Easter. No historical documentation about this. Herod had not killed Peter during the days of unleavened bread simply because he wanted to wait until Easter, since it is plain that both the Jews and the Romans would kill during a religious celebration. They literally, Herod's opinion seemed that he was not going to let the Jews have all the fun. Thus, we see God's providence, which had spirit-filled translators of our King James Bible, correctly translate Pascha as Easter. Okay, again, I believe it's correct. But there you have to ask yourself, so all the manuscripts were wrong? That reflect what would have been in the original. It's not the original, but they reflect that. That's literally, as King James Bible believers, our defense of the King James Bible. We say it follows the TR. It follows the better manuscripts. Well, here, it contradicts all the manuscripts. So I still believe the Holy Spirit leads them to write Easter. But this line of argument, here's the differentiator, is that this line of arguments implies that Pascha, Passover, is wrong in all the manuscripts. And then out of the blue, Easter comes in 1611 to correct all the manuscripts. That's not true. That's not how the Lord works. I don't believe that. It most certainly did not refer to the Jewish Passover. In spice, it did, but I'll tell you what's happened here. It's like the KJVO'S, we got stuck in a sense. Because what happened was, this is essentially an admission that Easter was airlifted out of nowhere and kind of just airdropped, I should say, into the text out of nowhere. It was. But since we believe that the King James Bible translators should be, or led of the Holy Spirit of God, it shouldn't cause us to get nervous about it. Okay? You can easily believe that that was the designation of the actual, that had become the terminological designation of the Jewish Passover in a Gentile age, shifting from the use of Passover to Easter, and that the Holy Spirit of God led the King James Bible translators to use a word that is understood by the people. And we kind of make that argument in other places. Here, the reason why KJVO'S felt like they couldn't make that argument is because they actually believed what was sold them, that Easter is pagan. And that is where the problem is, which led them to come up with this kind of uncomfortable, contorted defense of the use of Easter. And that's what I want to clarify today. So we keep going. In spite of this obvious and irrefutable Bible truth, what do these three stooges do? And then he basically, says that they corrected the Passover. And then he says, wrong, wrong, wrong. Well, Passover can't be wrong. Both Easter and Passover are correct. And the fact that there's variant readings that are both given by inspiration is actually a King James Bible doctrine. If you compare Acts 8 and Isaiah 53 and Luke 4 together. So thus, if you're a Bible believer, I am, you can safely tell anyone using a translation out of the King James that they have a mistranslation of their Bible. I can't. I believe they have a correct translation. Pascha translates as Passover. That's correct. And I believe that the King James Bible translation is also correct. So let's sum up Brother Gibbs' points and counter them. Number one, it must also be noted that whenever the Passover, he says, is mentioned in the New Testament, The references. So I kind of extracted I extracted his points out of that long paragraph. Here's point number one that he makes. A very able Bible teacher that I respect very, very much. So that's why I'm careful with what I'm putting on the screen. He says, it must also be noted that whenever the Passover is mentioned in the New Testament, the reference is always to the meal to be eaten on the night of the 14th, not the entire week. The days of unleavened bread are never referred to as the Passover. Now, that is a typical example of the fallacy of assuming the premise, also known as begging the question. This is precisely what is being discussed. The question at hand is Acts chapter 12, verse 4, a reference to the entire week or 8 days of festivities? So Brother Gipp has already assumed that Acts 12:4 is not about that, so that he can now make the statement, it's never about that. But if Acts 12, verse 4 is about that, then we cannot make the statement that it's never about that. So that's why this is the fallacy of assuming the premise. This is probably the most common logical fallacy used in debates. The other point he raises, point number 2 over here, he says, although the term Feast of Unleavened Bread can be used to describe either the Passover or the days following it, the term the days of unleavened bread, that as such, that expression, is never applied to the holiday, to the entire 8 days of festivities. Again, that is the fallacy of assuming the premise, begging the question. Because if Acts 12:4 is doing that, then I cannot then say the Bible never does that. First, I have to prove that Acts 12:4 is not doing that to then be able to make the blanket statement, it never does that. And that's why that's the fallacy of begging the question or assuming the premise. So we've dealt with the first 2 points. Here's his third point now. Yeah, well, so it's not pagan. Or at least here's what you can say. There's very good arguments on both sides of the aisle. And for anyone to fall hard on either side, I have a little bit of a problem with that. There's actually a lot of reading to be done here before one can really have an opinion on this. And I'm sure you probably have done that, but there's a lot of reading to be done. Okay, so let's go on. Point number 3 that he makes in defending the word Easter in the King James Bible is this. In Exodus 12:17, the expression the Feast of Unleavened Bread refers exclusively to the day wherein the Passover is slain, just that particular night, right? From the 13th to the 14th. His proof for that is Exodus 12:17. You shall observe the Feast of Unleavened Bread, for in the selfsame day have I brought your armies out of land of Egypt. Therefore you shall observe this day in your generations by an ordinance forever. The problem with this is that this is not exclusive to the day. So this expression here, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which I can put in green, is not exclusive to the day, but includes the day. That's why the day is being highlighted, because it is the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. It's actually the first day is on the night of the Passover, and that's why you'll read about the days, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, sometimes being 8 days, and sometimes being 7 days, and sometimes being 8 days. Oh, thank you, baby. I love you too, baby. Now, here's the proof that it's not exclusively to the day wherein the Passover is slain. I just pulled out the context, the few verses before Acts 12:17, and 2 verses after Exodus chapter 12, verse 17. So let's read them together, shall we? All right. I've already pre-highlighted this for you in yellow. 7 days shall eat unleavened bread. Now notice, 7 days, the entire feast. Even the first day, ye shall put away the leaven out of your houses. So that first day here is part of the 7 days of unleavened bread. For whosoever eateth leavened bread from the first day until the 7th day. See how the feast includes the first day? So it's not exclusive. That soul shall be cut off from Israel. Verse 16, and here it is again, in the first day of those 7 days, there shall be an holy convocation, and in the 7th day there shall be an holy convocation. Now, verse 17, you shall observe the feast of unleavened bread. Watch this. The feast, the whole thing of unleavened bread. Let's put that, let me make it blue. That's what we started with in verse 15, up there in blue. So that's the verse that Brother Gipp is referencing. You shall observe the feast of unleavened bread, for in this self-same day, the one you just saw here, the first day, the first day, the first day. For in this self-same day have I brought your armies out of land of Egypt, therefore shall I observe this day in your generation. So Feast of Unleavened Bread is not exclusive to that first day. It is including that first day and saying this self-same day, meaning beginning from this day. Again, the proof is in the two verses right after. In the first month, on the 14th day of the month at even, ye shall eat unleavened bread until the 21st day of the month at even, 7 days. And if the context still hasn't convinced you, Mark chapter 14, verse 12 is formal. That Brother Gibbs' argument here is mistaken when he says that the expression the feast of unleavened bread refers exclusively to the day wherein the Passover is slain, and he quotes Exodus 12:17, because look at Mark 14:12. There's a lot of verses, guys. It takes a lot of verses to build a doctrine, really a lot. The first day of unleavened bread, when they killed the Passover, so even though it doesn't say the word feast, it actually places the first day of unleavened bread at the killing of the Passover, from the 13th to the 14th, and probably also from the 14th to the 15th, and not just from the 15th on. So point number 3 of Brother Gibb, sadly, is mistaken. And I still believe he's right in defending the word Easter, just for the wrong reason. Thank you so much, Sister Monique. Really appreciate it. God bless you, sister, and Lord bless it twofold. Oh, it started 3:30. You said, when did this start? It started about 25 minutes before you got on. Leviticus 23:5 and 2 Chronicles 35:17 differentiate between Passover and unleavened bread. So some verses do make that differentiation between like the night of the Passover itself and then the rest of the days. But even on that night, you couldn't eat unleavened bread. You remember that if you're at Acts 12. So here's a couple of verses that do differentiate. Granted, so Leviticus 23 verse 5 is one of them. It says on the 14th day of the first month, at even as the Lord's Passover. We do it like, and on the 15th day of this same month as the Feast of Unleavened Bread unto the Lord. Okay, so you've got the 14th day, you've got the 15th day. That's the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So here they're differentiated. In 2 Chronicles 35:17, they're also differentiated. The children of Israel that were present kept the Passover at that time and the Feast of Unleavened Bread 7 days. So they're differentiated, but as we saw, sometimes they're merged. Mark 14:12, the first day of unleavened bread when they killed the Passover. And that's why we consider, correctly so, that Luke 22:1 is doing the same thing. The Feast of Unleavened Bread do not, which is called the Passover. So Brother Gibbs' distinction is artificial. Often forgotten is Ezekiel 45 verse 21 and Deuteronomy 16. Because here's what I'm trying to show. When the Bible says, because here's to kind of put you back in place, the King James Bible, the KJVO'S defense of Easter is that the days of unleavened bread are one feast, that's the Jewish feast, and then Easter is a different pagan feast. And kind of the proof is that can't be Passover. Easter should not be translated Passover because Passover is just a designation of the first night, and which is thereafter followed by the days of unleavened bread. Luke says that we were already in the days of unleavened bread, and since they follow the night of the Passover, therefore Passover was already passed. So how can Herod be waiting till after Passover to kill him if Easter is Passover? That's the crux of it. I should have started with that. That's the crux of it. And what is pointed out by non-KJVOs, and I believe correctly, even though I'm a KJVO, is that doesn't make sense because the days of unleavened bread do include the feast of the Passover sometimes. So just because I disagree with the other side doesn't mean that they don't have a true argument. And I often say this in debate. Don't be scared about telling the other side about ceding a bad argument and recognizing a true point that the other side makes. We're way too afraid of ceding any ground. And they should also cede some ground to us also. The proof of that is that the days of unleavened bread could include the actual Passover, and that the word. So here's what I'm trying to show. Let me go back, make it clear. What I'm trying to show is that the word Passover, if it had been translated Passover, and the way it appears in the manuscripts as Passover, is correct, because the word Passover can refer to the entirety of the 8 days and is not just used exclusively in application to the first night when the Passover is slain. That's what you have to understand. The word Passover, it can have the narrow sense of just the night when the Passover is slain, but it can also bear the wider sense of the entire feast. So the Feast of 11 Days can cover the all 8 days, and the word Passover can also cover the entirety of the feast. It can. Here's the proof. Redefine Apologetics. Happy Resurrection Sunday. Happy Easter to you too, brother, and Resurrection Day, whatever you want to call it. Easter is definitely correct, and it is definitely, based on my King James Bible understanding, not a pagan holiday, not in the King James Bible. And that's kind of what I'm arguing here. So we'll go on with that. How do we know that the word Passover can apply to the entirety? Look in Ezekiel 45. Let me do it on my Bible. Look in Ezekiel chapter 45 and verse 21. Now, this is describing in the millennium, but same principle, though. Nothing changes. Okay. He says, in the first month, in the 14th day of the month, ye shall have the Passover. Ye shall have the Passover. What is the Passover? A feast of 7 days. Watch this. Unleavened bread shall be eaten. So the word Passover is not just used to describe restrictively the night of the slaying. It is also used by the prophet Ezekiel to describe the entirety of the feast. And it's equated with unleavened bread. So even if the King James Bible translators had written Passover in Acts chapter 12, verse 4, it would not have been wrong, because they would have been using it in the general sense of the entirety of the feast days, which is exactly why they chose Easter to communicate that sense of the general feast, because they realized that the reader in Acts chapter 12, verse 4, that is, I believe, the real reason why they did that. They realized that if you don't understand that the word, what should have been here Passover for Easter, if you don't understand that it could refer to the entirety of the feast, then it could throw the reader off, but the days of unleavened bread are after the night of the Passover. So the Passover is already passed. How is Herod still waiting after Passover to kill him, since Passover has already passed? So to help the reader out, they pivot to the word Easter, which carries with it the connotation of the entirety of the feast, meaning not after the actual night of the slaying of the Passover, but he's waiting for the entire feast of the Passover to be over. And the word Easter was conducive to communicating that umbrella sense. Oh, that's fine, brother. Happy Easter. I thought you can say whatever you want, and that's why I said also Happy Resurrection Day. Both are good. Actually, the purpose of this video is also to say, hey, both are good. Both are acceptable. Both are good. You follow now so far? Let me show you another passage that also makes Passover the entirety of the feast. Here's Deuteronomy chapter 16, verse 1. The Lord says, observe the month of Abib and keep the Passover unto the Lord thy God, for in the month of Abib the Lord thy God brought thee forth out of Egypt by night. Thou shalt therefore sacrifice the Passover, it's in yellow, unto the Lord thy God, of the flock and the herd, in the place which the Lord shall choose to place his name there. Thou shalt eat no leavened bread with it. The Passover that's sacrificed, 7 days shalt thou eat unleavened bread therewith. Whoa. So the Passover, the actual sacrifice, now you're not supposed to eat it the next day. If you remember, you couldn't leave any of it till the next day. That's an important point. Bear in mind that under penalty of death, that you could not leave any of the Passover sacrifice. Till the morning. So how can it still be therewith with the Passover? Because now he's shifting. He is employing the semantic range of the word. He's changing the semantic range of the word Passover from restrictively the night of the slaying to the entirety of the feast. And that's why you have 16:4, there shall be no unleavened bread seen with thee in all thy coasts 7 days, neither shall there anything of the flesh which thou sacrificed the first day at even remain until all night till the morning. There it is. See that? So it's verse 4. Verse 4. Verse 8, 6 days shalt thou eat unleavened bread, and on the 7th day shall be solemn assembly. What is all that called? The Feast of Unleavened Bread. The whole thing is called the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So the Feast of Unleavened Bread, A, covers the night of the Passover slaying. B, the word Passover has a semantic range to also apply to the entirety of the feast days. And so Luke 2, verse 41, watch this. Now his parents went to Jerusalem every year at the Feast of the Passover. And when he had fulfilled, when he was 12 years old, they went up to Jerusalem after the custom of the feast. And when they had fulfilled the days of what? Of the feast of the Passover. So you see that? It's more than 1 day. Actually, I got to add this when I was countering Brother Gibbs' point. Here. There's another one. The Feast of the Passover, multiple days. See? Multiple days. I'll open the mic. You can come on, guys, and tell me specifically in anything I've said so far that you disagree with. So, I've answered, I believe, Brother Gibbs' points, which is an excellent Bible scholar. I understand his motivation. I think it's a noble motivation. And he says himself, not everybody can be right about everything, otherwise we'd be God. I can't be right about everything about all the time either. Okay. And then lastly, his point was that Herod celebrated a pagan festival called Easter. There is no historical proof. Now, to that point, there's no historical proof, guys, that Herod Antipas ever celebrated the feast of Astarte. Okay? Astarte was a Semitic goddess worshipped in Canaan, Phoenicia, and Mesopotamia. Eostre is a Germanic spring goddess mentioned only once in historical literature by Bede. Now, you got that? Only once in historical literature by Bede, 8th century. No ancient sources connect Herod to Eostre. There's no archaeological or textual evidence of Eostre being known in 1st century Judea. There isn't. As far as Herod's religious practices, the Herodian dynasty was ethnically Idumean. I think he was hybrid, but practiced Judaism. Herod Antipas publicly conformed to the Jewish customs, though personally immoral. Observing fertility feasts like those of Astarte or Eostre would have scandalized the Jewish population. And so the argument that Herod was celebrating a pagan feast kind of betrays a lack of familiarity, really, with even a BC history, because that was a big point of contention between the Jews that founded the Hasmonean dynasty and rebelled against the Seleucid Hellenic Empire and established the independent state of Israel for a while before Pompey conquered Jerusalem in 63 BC, because the whole thing was, we don't want gymnasiums here. We don't want to be Hellenized. We don't want the temple of your Zeus over in Jerusalem. And we're going to stick to the law. That's what you read. That's what the Maccabees were. So there's no way Herod would have been celebrating a pagan feast. Personally immoral, yet. Publicly celebrating a pagan feast, no way. Just read some history. The Jews would have lost their minds, especially the Zealots. The Gospels depict Herod as a corrupt ruler, but not overtly pagan in his religious practice. All right. So this is my point, what I was telling you earlier. This is the Cambridge commentary. Okay. I should have put that earlier first. Here, let me put that. This should go. Let's go there. There's the Cambridge commentary. So the Cambridge commentary, let me go to Acts to show you how old this thing is. It's not super old, but it's interesting. I like the old commentaries. Here it is. Published in 1882. So the researcher would be before 1882. They tell you why they chose Easter. The rendering Easter is an attempt to give by an English word the notion of the whole feast. That this meaning and not the single day of the Pascal feast is intended by the Greeks seems clear from the elaborate preparation made. As for a longer imprisonment than was the rule among the Jews, Peter was arrested at the commencement of the Passover feast, and the king's intention was to proceed to sentence and punish him when the feast was at an end on the 21st. So this is what I was telling you, and the Cambridge commentary agrees, because otherwise, if they would read Passover, they must get confused because they would think the Passover is restricted just to the one day. That's why they put Easter. We've shied away from this because, it's pagan, it's pagan. Now, let me tell you about this pagan stuff here. Yeah, that's fine. I'm going to have to put that. There we go. I put that below this. So you're looking at the future commentary on the Book of Acts, guys. All right. I'm going to do this. Okay. By the way, if you believe Easter is a pagan, you have to believe that the word Christmas is also pagan, should not be used. Okay, you can't. If you do, then you're consistent. But you can't have Christmas and be anti-Easter. It doesn't work. Okay, what about this whole claim about Easter is the pagan goddess Eostre? I'm going to show you my copy, because I read the whole thing, of Alexander Hislop's The Two Babylons. Let me show you one second. All right, there's my copy of the book. Before I get into it, let me hit some comments. Chris says the reason why it's a mistranslation of King James is that the translators defined Easter as being an only Sunday. Independent Church, how to find Easter forever and only has Sunday. No, that's so again, that's it's the exact opposite. That's a common misconception. That's like pointing out that in some Bible verses, the word Passover is just the night of the Passover. But then you come to find out the word Passover actually covers the entirety of the feast. They did it for the exact opposite reason, Chris, is to show that it applied to the entirety of the feast, which is what I showed also in the Cambridge commentary. So the reason why it's a mistranslation is because that's how the authors defined Easter within the King James Bible. They are the ones who defined it as Sunday. They didn't. As I showed you, they're doing the exact opposite. They're trying to show that it's broader than one day. That's the entire intent of why they chose Easter over the word Passover, because the word Passover would have strongly suggested to the reader that it's one day, and then you could have had what would have been a chronological problem. So they're helping out the reader by pivoting to Easter. Hey, Joseph, I see you. I'm going to have you on in a second. I know some King James onlyists insist that Easter in Acts chapter 12 is a pagan feast and that Herod kept it, and they broke fellowship over me for arguing against that. Well, then that particular point, I agree with you, Brother Chris. And I wouldn't break fellowship neither with you nor with them. Call me inspired. Hey, at Council Night, Dr. George Antonius, how are you? I'm fine, thank you. Saved, and Lord, too good to me, to the point where I'm ashamed of it. But I'm good, thank you. It's good to see you. Hey, Brother Joseph, welcome back.
Man, every time I think I've got something the Lord showed me, you do a better job with it than I get. So I talked to my pastor about this the other day. I was like, I think we've got a bad misconception that Easter's pagan, you know? And
Right.
my defense of it was a little bit different, and tell me if you feel like this holds up or not. His whole reason for capturing Peter is because he's just killed James, the brother of John. And so he wants to appease the Jews, right?
Right.
So obviously you have the Passover that occurs, like you were saying, on the 15th. Then you start the days of unleavened bread. I think there's actually like a weird parallel between that year and this year, where there's like the Feast of the First Fruits is on the same time when Jesus Christ was crucified or whatever.
Okay.
Anyhow, with that being said, I think that from what I've read about this, what all early Christians called their celebration of the resurrection was Pascha, which was the Passover. And
Mhm.
instead of using the word Pascha, they just used the word Easter. And it kind of shows you that about a decade after Christ, it was already common practice for Christians to celebrate the resurrection. I mean,
Right.
which wouldn't be crazy because, I mean, the whole reason we have church on Sunday is because of the resurrection. Um,
Right.
so, I mean, that was what I had gathered from it. I know you're probably going to go into the whole Estremoth thing. Um, I don't know if you're aware of the guy, but he's not a King James guy at all. But if you're aware of Wesley Huff, he's got some
Yeah.
interesting stuff on this as well, and I thought it was really good.
Yeah, I'm aware of Wesley Huff. Somebody asked me to do a reaction video to this thing on the King James Bible. I might. I just have so many things I want to do. If anybody can put me in contact with him, I'd love that because he's Canadian. But yeah, and by the way, like it's happened to me the same thing too. Like I was teaching that Judgment Seat of Christ is on Earth, and then I found out Sluter was already doing that. Even the stuff on Easter, I'm going to share some links that people have already done great research on this. But yeah, so now the word Easter it is Germanic. So
Yeah.
I don't know if like I don't know if you were saying that the word Easter itself was being used a few years after Christ.
No. Like, so the word Pascha, which is obviously in the text, right? The
Right.
word for Passover, and I don't know Greek, so if I butcher that, just forgive me. Like, anyhow, if you were to Google what's the Greek word for Easter, that's what would pop up. It's the exact same word. And I think that was commonly referred to. My basic assumption is this: is that Herod's waiting to kill Peter so that he can make a big strike on the early Christian community, basically on what is their most reverential day, right? Does that make sense or no? Like, he's actually waiting to do this to kind of make the Jews happy and hurt the early church. He's waiting to kill him on when they would have celebrated Easter, because obviously the early church, 10 years after the cross, they're still keeping all of the Jewish customs. You know, they're probably still keeping the days of unleavened bread, I would assume, at this time.
Okay,
But
so
this is
correct
just
me if I let me see if I understood you correctly. Are you saying that the Christians were celebrating Easter about a week after the slaying of the Passover?
Yeah, I think they're probably they're waiting to celebrate Easter until the days of unleavened bread have passed during this year, right? I mean, that would be an assumption on my part, but that would be what I would say if you were to say that that's what it is. It's conjecture on my part to say that this is what the same exact thing that we have today. But obviously, our whole timing for Easter is based on the Catholic Church and stuff like that, right? Like our calendar saying it's Easter. The same way with our calendar saying this is when Jesus Christ was born,
Yeah,
right? Like
yeah.
but
Go ahead.
but I think that the term Easter comes from, it's a dramatic term. This is all borrowed information, so forgive me if I butcher this, but essentially Estra is the month in which Easter occurred, in the same way like in the States where we say the 4th of July. The 4th of July has nothing to do with Independence Day. It's just so attached to we're celebrating Independence Day. We're not celebrating the 4th of July. You know what I'm
Right.
saying? We're not
Yeah.
celebrating Cinco de Mayo. You're celebrating your independence. It was the same thing as that was such a big celebration that kind of it just took over the meaning. The same of the month became the name of the holiday. Does that make sense or no?
Yes. So that's a viable, that part there is a viable explanation to me.
Yeah. So what I'm
But
saying is when the King James Bible is translated, everyone's already referring to the Christian celebration that we
that
know
yes,
as Easter, right?
yes,
And
that's
this
correct.
might
That's why.
be a signal back into this time that the same term that's being used here is to signal that, oh, Christians may have been celebrating the resurrection of Jesus Christ
It's
10 years
well,
after the death of Jesus Christ.
I mean, it's your view. So I agree with the part about the name can become synonymous for an event, but in the first century, first of all, it's the whole thing. Timing thing is a bit of a moot point because you're in the first century, and the Christians are very much Jewish still. The whole point
Yeah.
of them using Easter is not to distinguish between a Christian Easter and a Jewish Passover. The whole point of them using Easter is to basically communicate, because in the word Easter in the mind of a 17th century Englishman would have carried the entire week. And this maybe is a bit difficult here in the West to kind of conceive of. Where I come from, we still have the influence of Palm Sunday is still a big deal. For us, Easter is an entire week. It's not Resurrection Sunday.
Yeah.
But Eastern Christians, it's when you say Easter, you're talking about Sunday to Sunday. You're talking about 8 days. That's how we talk about it. So
And
we even call it
very common. So
yeah.
I didn't give you my bad. I took over what used to be a Methodist church, right? They left the Methodist church, and I'm now their pastor. But I'm saying from the context of all of the tradition that we've lost by being Baptist because we separated ourselves so far from anything that could be associated with Catholicism. You know what I mean? Like
Right.
they still have some of those holdovers. So yeah, I noticed that even this year, it's Palm Sunday, and then obviously Ash Wednesday, right? And Good Friday and all that sort of thing. Like I think, I don't know. Maybe we might be running around the same thing. Do you think that this could have possibly been a signal that the Christians are also celebrating this, even if they're celebrating it in the same way? Maybe it's a holy holiday unto them for the week.
No, I
just
I don't think there's, in the text itself, within the context of the first century, I don't think any distinction of any kind is being created. There's no distinction being made. So basically, all that's being, because the text, the manuscripts all say Passover, all of them, without a single exception. So so now
which is what the church referred to Easter as up until the 3rd or 4th century, right? Our celebration of Easter.
I don't follow, Joseph.
Like
so let me tell you what I'm saying, and then you can kind of correct me, okay? But maybe
no, I'm not correct. I'm not correcting.
No, not correct.
I'm
but like, if there's anything not clear, we can clarify it. So
okay,
there's no distinction being made. You might as well, the King James Bible translators, I'm convinced, could have put Passover and it would have been just as fine. Okay, because the manuscripts all say Passover. The problem is, it was already the days of unleavened bread. So in the mind of a reader, okay, if you're most of the use of the word Passover is restrictive to the first night in the scriptures, most of it. So your average reader who's not familiar with Ezekiel 45 and not familiar with Deuteronomy 16, which are obscure passages, if they're not familiar with those, you look at unleavened bread and you're like, okay, well, I know the Passover is past, because you're already in the days of unleavened bread, and the first night of those is the Passover night, and yet the text is telling me that Herod is waiting till after Passover to kill Peter, but Passover has already passed. Why is it? So what's the problem? So to communicate, so the King James Bible translators are trying to say that the word Passover in verse 4 is not restrictive to the night of the slaying. It's used in the generic sense of the entire feast of the entire 7 days of the Passover. So to clarify that, meaning that the feast was still going on and Herod wasn't going to kill someone on the actual day of the feast. And the Jews were against this. Like, remember, they pulled Christ down from the cross because they didn't want him defiling their feast, right? So I mean, the KJVO defenders of Easter, I think, make a mistake there. They're like, oh, they wouldn't have a problem killing on the feast. They would have had a problem killing on the feast. They weren't going to kill during the feast. That's why Herod is waiting. He doesn't want to defile the feast for them. He wants to please them, but he's not going to do it during the feast so as not to offend them. Okay? So to communicate, so the King James Bible translators are trying to explain to the reader that you are still in that period of time called the Passover. The Passover there is being used in the generic sense of the entire feast days. Those days have not yet expired, which is why Herod is still waiting. To simplify things, they pivoted to the word Easter because Easter, in the common understanding, had that more generic connotation of the entirety of the 7 days. So when the 16th, 17th century Englishman reads Easter, it's easier for him cognitively to hear multiple days, and the days have not yet expired, and that's why Herod is waiting.
I think this. I think it's 100% more. Well, obviously, your explanation is 100% backed up by Scripture, and I believe that that is a way better explanation than what has been floating around our circles. Because the Ishtar thing is totally wrong. You would essentially be saying, like you were talking about, every translation of the Bible would have been wrong up until the King James, if that's what it's referring to, right? So that's the heathen holiday thing doesn't make sense. What I was saying was, if it's second century, because it's 150 AD, and you and me are going to celebrate what we call now Easter, right? What are we going to call it?
So,
what are we going to
so
call
to
it?
your point. So now, so let's move on. So great. So now that we moved on past the first century in which the Book of Acts is written, in time after the Book of Acts is written, it's true, Christians are going to start wanting differentiating themselves from the strictly Jewish connotation of the holidays, because now we've got an added connotation to them, given that Christ has risen and fulfilled those feast days. So so that's why eventually we are also looking to distinguish ourselves by nomenclature, by changing the terms. That's true. And I think that's where Easter comes in. That's why it had become common parlance amongst the Christians of the 17th century to use Easter. So so now you've got two theories. You've got one that says, and there might be some kind of overlap to them here. So one that says that that's because it's a pagan holiday that got Christianized, and there's some overlap here. Or you can say, well, not necessarily. There was a choice that made by the people, consciously maybe by some at least leaders of the church, to change terminology, and they picked Easter, and we're going to see why they picked Easter. So
what I was saying is that if it was 150 AD and you and me are celebrating, because I think sometimes what we've lost is that these traditions, they don't come out of nowhere, and because it's the same thing that happens with I did a whole series on saints, where what you'll do is you'll have the Catholic Church will call somebody a saint, and then we think that person was Catholic, and it was they never believed any Catholic doctrine at all, right? That was a Christian that died in their faith. And they co-opt them. And the same thing happened with Easter. If it's 150 AD, you and me are calling our celebration of Easter Pascha, which is Passover. That's what we're calling it. And what I was saying is that to me it was, if I know that is true, 50 years after the Gospel of John is written, then who's to say it wasn't true 90 years earlier, in the Book of Acts? It may have been. They may have been referring that the reference in Easter might make the King James Bible the most.
I'll tell you why. Because the manuscripts all say Passover.
Well, I know they're gonna say Passover because that's what Easter is commonly referred to as, and anyone reading it would know what they're talking about because they say, "Well, yeah, Passover was on the 15th, right? We had the day of preparation, then we had Passover on the 15th, then we had the days of unleavened bread." And now, 2 days into the days of unleavened bread is when Jesus Christ is crucified.
I hear you, but you understand it's a pretty tall ask to prove that, right?
No, I think it is conjecture on my part. I want to say that too. I want to say that's conjecture on my part. I thought of it as a nugget that could be true. Look, it's 100% true 50 years later from there, or 90 years later from this date, right? It's 100% true then. I'm just saying, can I back up the clock 90 years in the same way that I would say, how big of a jump is it for me to say that, P57 is true?
Okay, so let's get into the Easter. Let's get into the word Easter. I think it'll help us to circle back to this.
I'm gonna jump off. I gotta jump into work, brother. I love you.
Love you too,
you're doing a great job, man. I don't want anyone to get any other impression of that, man. I've really, I was excited when you jumped on here, so I feel like I'm gonna learn even more.
Oh, praise God. Thank you, brother. God bless you.
Take care, brother.
Easter.
The one issue I have.
Sorry, 1 second, Lucas. Rory, if you want to come on, I like people to have the camera on. So if you can turn on you got the camera on. Good job. All right. So, Chris, if you can make a quick point.
Yeah, my
Rory,
quick point would have just
just 1 second, Chris. And then, so just make a quick point, and then Rory, introduce yourself and make a quick point. Then I want to get into the etymology of Easter and the sources for the word Easter, and then we can come back and pick it up from there, because I want to have to present all the data before we can engage in the conversation more fully. Go ahead, Chris.
Right. This is going to be real quick. Polycarp learned from the disciples, John the Apostle. So we know that the apostles were still keeping Passover, and they were still teaching other people to keep Passover too. So this came from Rome. This did not come from the disciples. This came from Rome, because we see that this is the first people we can see talking about it. I think it's Bishop Sixtus, which is a Roman bishop. Bishop Anicetus, who is having that conversation with Polycarp in that argument. So Polycarp is saying, well, hey, I learned this from John the Apostles. Who did you learn it from? And he goes,
sorry, can you clarify what the argument is?
Well, my argument, with that other guy, he was saying that they were keeping that they were keeping Easter, like when I say Easter, just to simplify the conversation, I'm talking about Easter Sunday. So when he says they were keeping Easter, they weren't keeping Easter from what I see because of Polycarp. Polycarp makes it clear that they were keeping Passover still, and they were teaching it to other people to keep Passover.
Okay.
And so do all the churches of Asia.
Okay, fair. Rory, you want to tell us about yourself and make a comment or ask a question? Welcome to the channel, by the way.
Welcome. You've seen me before on her channel.
Which channel?
Lubna's.
Oh, okay. I've seen you on Lubna's. All right, cool. How are you?
I'm great. I've seen the debate with you and Zach. Yeah, the word Easter, you're right, is dramatic. I learned that from someone. From what I've heard read on Wikipedia, that it could mean Passover or something. Is that right?
So, and thank you, Joseph, for the donation. God bless you, brother. Appreciate that. So the manuscripts say Passover, okay, that we have.
Yeah.
The word Pascha, right? They say Passover. So the big debate is, why did the King James Bible translators use the word Easter instead of translating Pascha as Passover as they usually do, right? And so there's two lines of answers. So there's multiple lines of answers, and there's some overlaps in all those answers. So we're taking it one point at a time. Now we're in the phase of the conversation where we're discussing, is the word Easter related to a pagan holiday or not? So you've got one line of people. The majority of people say yes. Most of the people say yes. But then they say yes, and so therefore it's a mistake in the King James Bible. And then you've got King James Bible defenders who say, yes, they agree, it is a pagan holiday, but that was done intentionally by the King James Bible to differentiate between the pagan holiday and the Passover. I'm kind of in neither of those camps. I'm saying, whatever heathen connection there might have been to the word Easter, which I highly doubt, but even granting some of that, I'm saying the word Easter is used in the sense of resurrection, Germanic sense of resurrection, and it's being used to denote to the reader that Herod was waiting for the entirety of the feast of the Passover to end, not just for the actual night. And so in seeking to explain to the people that it was all of the days of the Passover for which Herod was waiting, they pivoted to use a word that carried that generic connotation. And that wasn't just restricted to Sunday. The very fact that we say Easter Sunday is also indicative that the fact that the word Easter was broader in scope, and then you had to limit it by adding the Sunday to the word Easter. It's a bit pedantic of a conversation, but it's a big deal because some people are claiming there's a mistake in the King James Bible, and I believe the King James Bible is perfect.
Also, before I go, are you going to have a Ask Me Anything live stream?
Do I want to ask you anything?
No. Ask me, as in you, anything live stream in your channel.
Sorry, can you explain, Rory? I'm not sure I understood you.
Basically, are you going to have a live stream where people ask you questions?
Oh,
and then that's what I mean.
Yes. Okay. Yes. So that's usually what the live streams are for. They're usually not themed. They don't have a particular theme. Today, the theme was Easter because we're in Easter, and it's a big deal. So I'll try to stop it at Easter for today. But usually the live streams are open for any questions. Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yeah. So you're more than welcome to come on. I try to live stream once a week.
I'll be respectful and not ask my questions. I do have the question in mind, but since it's about the books about Easter, subjects about Easter, I'm not going to ask my question.
Okay, I appreciate it. So what you can do, Rory, is I've got a Facebook group called Counsel and Might. It's a group. You can go join. You can we can talk there. I've got an Instagram account also, so you can contact me there. But I appreciate you and your limiting the questions to Easter, and we'll have more live streams, Lord willing, and we'll open it to a variety of questions.
Lord willing.
Thank you, Rory.
Okay, so I want to make a quick point about Easter and why I
Yeah.
think it's mistranslation in King James Bible, because in the Old English origin, it was associated with an Anglo-Saxon goddess. Hold on, now I'm not saying it's pagan. Just give me a second. So it was associated with an, because I'm getting into the etymology of the word, an Anglo-Saxon goddess associated with spring fertility and mentioned by well, hold on, I'm gonna skip all that part. But anyway, but basically the whole word about Easter, it does mean rising, right? That's part of the etymology, because Easter, rising from the east, right? So
correct.
Okay, so now if you start to say if I take and put the word Easter onto Passover, no, Passover, Jesus didn't rise on Passover. When you read Matthew 27, even though it makes it sound like Jesus rose on the same day he got crucified, he didn't rise on the same day. So you can't say he rose on the same day he got crucified. He was in the grave for 3 days. So therefore you cannot say he rose on the same day he was crucified. So therefore Passover is something totally different than Easter would be, because the whole word, why are you using a word for rising from the grave for Easter?
Okay, because Lucas,
for Passover.
So to that point, okay, if I look at the purpose of the King James Bible translators, according to the Cambridge commentary also, that I quoted, the purpose is to communicate. So, okay, do you understand what I'm saying when I say, okay?
Yeah, when you say
forget about that. If it says, if you're reading Greek, the manuscript, and you have the word Passover, right? Your average reader, I mean, I have problems with some chronologies in Bible text that takes me a few minutes to find out, is the days of unleavened bread, the night of the Passover has passed. Correct? When it says, then were the days of unleavened bread, the first night of the slaying of the Passover has passed. Correct?
I'm not. I'd have to reread that text, because I'm not sure if because when I'm just thinking of it off memory, all I know is that.
Okay, I'll share it on the screen.
The feast of Passover.
Okay, you see that there? I've got it in pink. He says, then were the days of unleavened bread. So they are in process. Correct?
I don't know. I don't know exactly what that word "then" is supposed to be referring to. Is it supposed to be saying that they arrested
when Peter's taken around the time
unleavened bread?
Okay, so around the time that Peter is taken, it's around. So Peter is taken. He could have been taken right before the first day of unleavened bread, but do you see that Peter is in prison during the days of unleavened bread? Would you agree to that?
Right, so they arrested him, and then were the days of unleavened bread. So it looks like, to me, when I'm reading this, they're waiting until after. But I'm not sure if they've already started yet, just from reading this.
Okay, but that's what I'm saying. Would you agree that Peter? It's a very limited kind of question. Would you agree that Peter is in prison during the days of unleavened bread?
Yes, he is in prison.
Okay. All right, fair. So we're in agreement. And now, technically, the first night of unleavened bread is the night in which the Passover is slain, correct?
Okay, so the Passover lamb is slain on the 14th. And so when they were doing the very first original Passover would have been like as soon as the sun comes down, right? So as soon as the sun comes down, it's actually technically not the 14th anymore. It's the 15th as soon as the sun goes down. So that's where it kind of gets confusing to people, because...
Okay, but I mean, that's kind of a little bit... It's irrelevant to my point that I'm making.
All right.
So it could be the 17th for all I care. The question is, isn't the first night on which you cannot have leavened bread is the night on which you slay the Passover, correct?
No, you slay the Passover prior to the night before you can have.
Well, when you eat it, okay, when you first eat it.
Because you slain the Passover on the 14th.
It's a straightforward question.
Got to be done before sundown on the 5th.
Right. You can't eat the Passover with leavened bread, or you die.
Right. Okay. Right. So it would be the 15th. Yes. That
right.
You would be eating.
Well, whatever it is, the number's not important. The point is, the number has no material impact on the discussion here. At the point I'm making, the point is, you can't the first day, night, whatever it is, whatever the number is, or the first night that you have to desist from eating leavened bread is that night when you first partake of the Passover lamb, correct?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So, and if Peter is there, as we agreed, during the days of unleavened bread, he's in prison, that means he's there after the first night of unleavened bread, correct?
Yeah, I see what you're saying, because you're saying Passover,
which is Passover,
the whole
right. So no, I'm just saying what happens to the reader. So I'm reading this. Here's what happens to me. Okay, I'm reading this. And I say, okay, Peter is there during the days of unleavened bread. So the night of the eating of the Passover has already passed. Now let's say I'm reading in Greek, and then I get to that he's intending after Pascha, to Pascha, the Passover, to bring it forth to the people. I might do a double take, like, wait, after the Passover, but the Passover night has already passed. And so it takes a reader who's well versed in the Bible to understand that to Pascha, let me highlight it here, let me put it in the Greek. It takes a seasoned reader to understand that in Acts 12:4, when it says Pascha over there, that this is not used in the restrictive sense of the first night when the Passover is eaten, but it's the word Passover being used in the generic sense of the entire feast of unleavened days. Herod is waiting for the whole feast to end before he can kill him, all the days to end before he can kill him. But it takes a reader who understands that sometimes the word Passover is used in that broad sense. And so to clarify to the reader that there's no chronological problem here, the King James Bible translators, independent of the etymology of the word Easter, we can get into that, but the guy on the street in 17th century England is not analyzing the etymology of the word Easter. The way it's used is into Easter, the entire feast, like we do it still, the Eastern Christians, from Sunday to Sunday. It's got that generic connotation to it. So the King James Bible translators, I agree with you, they completely airdropped this. That was completely airdropped out of nowhere. They airdropped the word Easter because the word Easter covers the entire scope of the feast and therefore communicates to the reader that Herod is waiting for the entirety of the days to end, not for the actual Passover night to end, which had already passed since you were already in the days of unleavened bread while Peter is in prison. Do you follow?
I understand what you're saying, but I think it still would have been simpler just to leave the word Passover there, because it was there.
Okay.
In all the other texts, why not leave it there? And I think
Fair.
people would come to the same understanding that you came to if they just would have left the word there. And by putting Easter there, it makes it sound like there's a whole different word there. And now that's get people to think all different things, which winds up ending fellowship, because I got crazy people going, no, that has to be the pagan Easter. It's something different. Or making another argument. No, they were starting to celebrate this new Christian festival called Easter. No.
So great, but so here's the thing. I'm happy because we made some progress, because now the conversation has shifted to, okay, I agree, but there would have been an easier way to do this. Now, that's a fair opinion. We can discuss this, but you understand what I'm saying. That's what counts to me.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. I'm just saying I think it would have been it makes more sense since Passover means the 14th, and it also means the start.
Okay, so you understand. So to be clear, okay, so I'm glad we agree at least on that particular. And by the way, I'm in an odd situation, and you are in an odd situation that I'm actually agreeing with you on things you didn't expect me to agree with you. And we
would kind of see eye to eye a little bit.
Yeah, right. So I'm on this positionally, I'm on the side of the KJVO'S, because I believe the King James Bible doesn't have a mistake. I don't believe Easter is a mistake. But the arguments you're raising are true, and I agree with you. So I'm arriving at the defense of the word Easter along a different path than my KJVO brothers and sisters are. So I take on board what you're saying because I recognize the veracity of your arguments. I think they're true. But even with them being true, I still think Easter is good, because now you're experiencing breaking up a fellowship and unfortunate disagreements over the use of the word. That's a modern phenomenon. And by the way, this happens it could happen in any verse in any given time frame of church history. But in 17th century England, Great Britain, in the world, that wasn't an issue. That's why they used Easter, because everybody would have understood that it was generic. So the break in fellowship is happening, is incidental to like modern day developments and studies in etymology that have become, common and widespread nowadays. They certainly were not 150 years ago as they are today. So I want to show you an article here by, this is Answers in Genesis, about the etymology of Easter. And this first, actually, let me show my friends something here. This is, so the only source for Easter being Eostre, this is what popularized that notion, The Two Babylons by Alexander Hislop. You've ever read that book?
Yeah, I actually have. That's one of the first books I've read when
right. So that's exactly, and that's where I was going with it. Right. So this is a classic, right? And here's what happens: is that Alexander Hislop majors on etymology, and I think etymology is kind of the amateur's lure. Okay. He builds so much. Now, I agree with his conclusions. I agree with his conclusion about Babylon and the Babylonian system. I agree with it. But I think 9 out of 10 arguments are to be thrown out of the book, because etymology is so elastic that you can do whatever you want with it, unless you have a very, very, very rigorous study of the origination of a word, which is very hard to find. So what happens is a whole bunch of Christians are directed to this book, and it's an excellent in its conclusions. And I think a lot of Christians are kind of in awe of the use of etymology in there. And Hislop doesn't do a good job to prove his point etymologically. He's the guy that popularized in our ranks this concept that Easter is Eostre. His only source is the 7th century English monk Bede. That's it. There's no other source that Easter is Eostre. If this was any other academic discussion, we would be requiring much more evidence to make the connection between Easter and Eostre than Bede, and that there's a month called Easter somewhere. So let me ask you this to start. Do you know of any historical source documentation that connects the word Easter with a pagan holiday other than Bede?
No, actually only Bede is what I know of. So that's why I don't even use his arguments. So I do agree with you there, because people, say, well, if it's only Bede, you got to kind of come up with something more. So that's why I just basically go to the basic word of Easter does mean to rise. It's associated with the spring. And so that's why I don't like to say, oh, well, Easter is interchangeable with Passover. That's where it's like I draw the line. No. You can't have Jesus rising on Passover. So they got to be two different words, two different things. And it comes down to people saying, well, you're Judaizing if you do the Passover, and you should be more Romanized and do Easter Sunday, is mostly what people argue for, because everything I see about this Easter Sunday celebration, it comes from the Roman Church, because like I said, I see Anicetus doing it. I see Sixtus doing it. It looks like it starts in Rome in the West, and they're the ones who influence it. Well, meanwhile, all the Asian churches who had people like Polycarp who learned directly from the disciple John, they were keeping Passover. So I'm just getting back to why are we following Rome instead of doing it like the apostles and Polycarp did?
Okay, so it looks like someone's trying to join, but it's not working. If you guys want to join, click the link at the top of the chat, guys. All right, so Chris, with our newfound understanding and agreement that the word Passover sometimes, okay, let me backtrack a little bit. So I agree with you that Christ doesn't rise on Passover. Nobody could disagree with you on that. Okay, because Passover is when he dies. You can't confound when he rises from that.
It's an inappropriate word to use Easter for Passover.
Right. So that argument you're making, though, in an odd way, beautifully illustrates my point about the word Passover and the semantic ambivalence of the word Passover being confusing, and why the King James Bible translators use Easter. You kind of just made my point unwittingly. Here's why. Because when you make the point that Christ doesn't rise on Passover, you defaulted back to the base, not wrong, yet not exclusive, understanding that Passover is just the night of the Passover. So when you make the argument to those guys, when you're telling them Christ doesn't rise on Passover, the premise is that you're using the word Passover to refer to the night in which the Passover is slain. But we've also pointed out that the word Passover has a wider semantic range, which is to refer to the entirety of the feast. And if you take that broader connotation of the word Passover, then it is not technically inaccurate to say that Christ, Easter, and Passover are interchangeable. They become interchangeable when you are looking at the broad scope application of the words. In the broad scope of the word Passover that applies to the entirety of the feast, then Easter and Passover are interchangeable. They're not interchangeable if you're restricting the word Passover to the slaying of the Passover night. So when the King James Bible, when I say, at least, I should speak for myself, when I say they're interchangeable, I'm talking about the broad scope of the word Passover, because he does rise within the Feast of Unleavened Days, which is still called Passover. So the third night after the slaying of the Passover is still Passover. The fourth night after the slaying of the Passover is still Passover.
Well, yeah, because even me and my friends, we casually have sometimes just called the whole thing Passover. So yeah, I have no, I think that's correct. It's just, I just don't, me personally, I just don't like inserting Passover on top where Easter where Passover is, because Easter, they got two different meanings to me.
Well,
so
no, that's what we're saying. No, they could have two
confusing.
different meanings if you use the restrictive sense.
Right,
they are
right.
interchangeable, right? If you've got the broad scope sense. So, and I understand what you're saying. So what you can say is you've got a subjective opinion that you would have rather it not be done, but that's different than saying that it leads to a doctrinal mistake or a doctrinal error. And that's what I'm saying, that it doesn't.
Yeah,
and
I'm just someone that likes consistent translations, like translate the word.
Okay, but do you understand that's right? But I get that. But you understand that's a different topic. It's a completely different ballgame than saying Easter is doctrinally incorrect. Do you follow?
Right, and I guess another point was just the fact that when they put it in that appendix, and I understand you're saying for a broad scope, but I just, that when they define it in that appendix in the King James Bible as being like the Sunday, Sunday and all that, it just, and then you insert it that one place. You didn't, because you could have inserted it other places, but why did you but you inserted it that one place, and it seems so weird. But I guess that one place you could kind of argue that one place might be okay.
No, inshallah.
But just so you don't have silence, I'll just keep talking for a minute because I see you're on mute. So, but so hey, I'll just go on to this next question I got since you're on mute.
Yeah. So no, so I'm gonna get there. He wants to play some more. He's already played enough today. We're gonna watch the Jesus movie. There's a new Jesus. No, actually, no. The Sight and Sound. For those of you who are interested, they've got their Jesus play. You can watch it for free on during Easter weekend. So we're going to look at that in a second. So we're going to into screen time. Let me show you. This is let me share my screen. This is a great article on the etymology of the word Easter. I don't know if you've read this. Have you read this by Answers in Genesis?
No, I'll take a look at it afterwards. So it's Answers in Genesis, the name of Easter of pagan origin.
Right. Okay. So to those who have used, Alexander Hislop wrote this, Woodrow also. To those who have used Woodrow's early work, please note that he has changed his position on many of the conclusions in the book. Woodrow has stopped circulating his early work and replaced it with an updated The Babylon Connection ? To demonstrate some of the false conclusions concerning pagan connections presented by Hislop. And it's true. It's unfortunate that Woodrow did that, that Hislop did that, caused Woodrow to do the same, and then Woodrow came to the same conclusion that a lot of us did, like, you're really playing with the etymology here. It's not. This is what happens constantly in debates. It's like we want to win so bad that we allow ourselves so much and we allow the interlocutor so little. And then you end up, a lot of guys realize that they've used bad arguments and then they drop their entire position. Okay, so there remains only one written record of a goddess who might be connected to Eostre of the Saxons. The church scholar Bede, who lived in modern-day England from AD 673 to 735, recorded the names of several of the goddesses worshipped by early Saxons. The kind of Viking invader, no, those are the Normans invaded. He identified Eostre as one whose festivals were celebrated in the month given her name. So this is the passage here. Eosturmana has a name which is now translated Pascal month, and he writes in his time, and which was once called after a goddess of theirs named Eostre, in whose honor feasts were celebrated in that month. Of course, he would have to source that. He doesn't, so we're going to have to take him at his word. Now, they designate that Pascal season by her name, calling the joys of the new rite by the time-honored name of the old observance. And even if that's true, if it's talking about a rising because it's in April and it's resurrection, my reaction is, so what? Bede's description was tentatively confirmed in the 19th century by Jacob Grimm. Grimm was a linguist of the highest caliber who studied and preserved the histories, languages, and traditions of the Germanic peoples, also called Teutonic and Older literature. These groups would have shared a common language family, and Grimm traced the connections among many of their gods and goddesses in his writing. Bede is discussed in the work Teutonic Mythology, first published in 1835. So this is the Grimm now. The two goddesses, whom Beda, de Temporum Ratione, cites very briefly, so he says that he cites very briefly, without any description, merely to explain the months named after them, as Hrede and Eastre, March taking its Saxon name from the first, and April from the second. It would be uncritical to saddle this father of the church, who everywhere keeps heathenism at the distance, and tells us of it less than he knows, with the invention of these goddesses. Fair. We Germans to this day call April, watch, Ostermonat. Now you can see Easter there in Oster. You see that?
Right.
Okay. And Ostermanoth is found as early as Eginhard in the 800s. The great Christian festival, which usually falls in April or the end of March, bears in the oldest of High German, remains the name Ostara. And it is mostly found in the plural because 2 days, Ostertaga and Austartaga, were kept at Easter. This Ostra, like the Anglo-Saxon Eastre, must in the heathen religion have denoted a higher being whose worship was so firmly rooted that the Christian teachers tolerated the name and applied it to one of their own grandest anniversaries. All the nations bordering on us have retained the biblical Pascha. Even Ulfilas writes Pascha, not Austro, though he must have known the word. The Norse tongue also has imported its Paskir. French also uses La Pâque. So, some scholars have called Eostre an invention of Bede and discount the connections, but the confirmation of Grimm cannot be easily discredited, nor does the quality of Bede's other works lead us to disbelieve him. So that's a fair. Grimm established a clear connection between the Anglo-Saxon Eastre and the German Ostra. Similar connections are found in etymologies that describe the origin of Easter from many sources. Esther and Oster, the early English and German words, both have their roots in aus, which means east. So not just rising. Shine and dawn in various forms. Shining, the rising is a secondary derivation from east because the sun rises in the east. These names may have developed independent of the name of the goddess as a reference to the Easter festivals, or they may have been related to her name in some way. Could there be another origin of the name Easter? Contrary to suggesting connection to a Saxon goddess, some have suggested Easter finds its root in the German word for resurrection, Aufstehung. In a footnote to his translation of the work of Eusebius, Christian F. Cruz defended the usage of the word Easter. Quote, our English word Passover, happily, in sound and sense, almost corresponds to the Hebrew Pesach, of which is a translation in Exodus 12:27. The Greek Pascha, formed from the Hebrew, is the name of the Jewish festival applied invariably in the primitive church to designate the festival of the Lord's resurrection, which took place at the time of the Passover. Our word Easter is of Saxon origin and of precisely the same import with its German cognate Ostern. The latter is derived from the Old Teutonic form of Aufstern, Aufstehung, i.e. resurrection. The name Easter is undoubtedly preferable to Pascha or Passover, but the latter was the primitive name. Nick Sayers argued along these lines to suggest that the origin of Easter in English comes from the German. Quote, because the English Anglo-Saxon language originally derived from the Germanic, there are many similarities between German and English. Many English writers have referred to the German language as the mother tongue. The English word Easter is of German-Saxon origin and not Babylonian, as Alexander Hislop falsely claimed. The German equivalent is Oster. By the way, we still have a French Bible till this day. It's called the Osterwald, meaning from the east. Oster is related to Ost, which means the rising of the sun, or simply English, because east. Oster comes from the Old Teutonic form Aufsterhen, Aufsterhung, which means resurrection, which in the older Teutonic form comes from two words, Ester, meaning first, and Stehen, meaning to stand. These two words combine to form Esterhen, which is an old German form of Aufsterhen, the modern-day German word for resurrection. In the Hebrew, Passover is Pesach. The Greek form is simply a transliteration and takes the form Pascha. Virtually all languages refer to Easter as neither a transliterated form of Pascha or use resurrection in the name. English and German stand apart in their use of Easter to refer to the celebration of the resurrection. You've got the table there of the forms of Pascha in the different languages. Resurrection in Serbian, Chinese, Korean, Vietnamese. We should also consider the early translations by German English scholars in this examination. John Wycliffe was the earliest translator to publish a complete New Testament in English in 1382. Though he did it from the Latin Vulgate, he translated the word Pascha to Pasch rather than translating it. When Martin Luther translated the Bible into German, he chose the word Oster to refer to the Passover references before and after the resurrection. William Tyndale translated the Bible into English from the Greek and Hebrew, and his New Testament, 1525, used the word Esther to refer to the Passover. In fact, we wrote our English word Passover to Tyndale. When translating the Old Testament in 1530, he coined the term, coined it, to describe how the Lord would pass over the houses marked with the blood of the Lamb, because even Passover is actually a coined term if you want to go down that route, right? The usage of Esther was retained in the 1534 revision of the New Testament, and it was not until later that it was known as Easter, adding the A. Luther and Tyndale were the first to use translation of Pascha rather than transliteration. The following are comparisons of the early translations by Wycliffe, Luther, Tyndale, and the translators of 1611 King James Version, demonstrating the handling of Pascha, and you can go through them and you guys can check that on your own. So long story short, you guys can go on and read it. Conclusion, I'll just read the conclusion. In an attempt to honor God, many have desired to move away from the term Easter, using Resurrection Day in its place. What could be more fitting or clearer than to simply refer to the day on which to celebrate the risen Lord as Resurrection Day? I can think of no better solution to this topic, but I am aware that many Christians will continue to use the term Easter with a clear conscience. I trust that as this topic is discussed, Christians will seek to keep their focus on it anyway. So, celebrate Easter Sunday. So the idea is this. There is just as much, if not more, etymological sources saying that Easter is actually Germanic for resurrection.
Well, see, I don't have a problem with that because Easter, you're rising. So I just don't, like I said, I just don't like it when they try to say it. They try to say those words are interchangeable, except for that one occasion. If you want to say because it's referring to the entire feast, maybe it's interchangeable there. You want to argue, okay, but for the rest of the Bible, you could not interchange the word Easter with Passover. Is what
well, and which is why they didn't for the rest of the Bible. They only did it in Acts 12:4.
So yeah, and
you follow, right?
Right.
So it works.
But
and the other thing is, when people speak, they're almost never, ever conscious of the etymology. Like when I use handkerchief, a kerchief is a couvre-chef. It's for your head. I don't cover my head with something I blow my nose in, but I still say handkerchief. So it's a little pedantic it's a bit of a Nats training thing to fall on the sort of, well, the etymology of Easter. It's the people understood it. It's there. Now I can understand your point. If you say, hey, I think they should have just stuck with Passover and dependent on the context to figure it out, which is actually the Cambridge Bible Commentary argument, is that you could have figured it out from the context, right? And there might have been some extra reasonings and some prelates of the church, because I have some more documentation that I'm not going to bore the reader with sharing, but I've got more documentation about some people who wrote comments on possibly why the word Easter was used. But the end-all be-all of it was to make it more understandable to the reader. So what people could say is, so your camp could say, look, okay, it's not doctrinally wrong, and we understand the thinking behind it, but we believe there would have been a better way. That's fine. For our side, I think, unfortunately, we just took on board Alexander Hislop's argument that Easter is pagan, and I think that has a lot to do. This is an important point here. That's the pastor kind of in me speaking here. Is we love Christians in the adolescence stage of the Christian life. like to latch on those things. Like you see that something is heathen, possibly in origin. You're like, oh, I'm not going to have anything to do with that. And then you kind of disconnect from it because that's a physical way to signal spirituality. But I think there's a more mature way of handling those things. I'm not going to get into it now. But this is the reason why people flock so much to like, oh, Easter is pagan, oh, Easter is pagan, right? When it turns out, no, actually, you can't really say it's pagan because there's just as much information, actually, technically, literally, more information connecting it to the word, the etymology to the resurrection, than to a pagan goddess called Eostre. Also, the whole argument about pagan things that got pagan feasts and concepts that are Christianized is half the story. I keep telling the church that and others that is, if you pick it up, if you go, well, it was the worship of the regeneration of nature in the month of April, and that got Christianized, fine, but that's half the story, because then I would double back and ask, us, why was that a heathen concept to begin with? Heathen concepts don't emerge out of nothingness. Heathen concepts are often, actually always, nothing more than a perversion of a pre-existing spiritual truth. So the Lord coded the resurrection into nature to preach to us through nature, the resurrection from the dead, in that winter things die and spring things resurrect. And I've even read Socrates, heathen Greek philosophers, argue for the veracity of the resurrection, not based on the Jewish scriptures, but based on the fact that nature comes back to life. So they kind of got the message that the Lord coded into nature. So I think what happens is the Lord starts by, it's God that sets the cycles of the seasons. He's the one that sets harvest, that comes up new life. He's the one that sets the end of the hibernation of animals in the springtime. He's the one that sets the return to warmth and to life of vegetable animal life in the springtime. And then the heathen take that and correctly identify fertility and a springing back to life. But because they're misguided in their ignorance, it devolves into paganism. And Christianity, it's not that it's Christianizing heathenism, it is re-Christianizing concepts that had been heathenized. And so I got no problem at all with looking at Easter. It is not a heathen word. It's not connected to Eostre. It is not a pagan holiday. It was just the King James Bible translator's effort in using a word whose etymology means resurrection to convey to the reader that this word Passover here is being used in the generic sense, even though the Passover night has passed. That's why Herod is still waiting to convey that to their immediate audience. They used the word Easter, which was common amongst the folk and understood to be broader in scope than the possibly more restrictive word Passover. That's the be-all, end-all of my argument.
Okay. Yeah, so that's fair to go with your title of your initial title of your video. Those are fair arguments. It's just from my side, and just so people understand, like if you ever heard me in the past go, I think Easter is pagan, I'm not really going about the nuance of the word. I'm just basically taking the fact of Passover means one thing, Easter means another. And I'm like, and normally Easter celebration, when people think of it, they think of Sunday. And that Sunday
here in the West.
In the West. Yeah.
In the West. In the West, they think of Sunday. Where I come from, it's 8 days. In the East, the concept that Easter is a 8 days of celebration, because Palm Sunday is much more present with us, Eastern Christians, that is with Western Christians. But in the West, because, well, it's a long story, we can get into it. But yeah, in the West it is. But in the East, we still think of Easter as that entirety of the week.
Yeah, see, I have kind of some different views because I believe Jesus got crucified on a Wednesday. So yeah, Palm Sunday
I believe that
makes sense to me.
But I believe that too. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. That's awesome, because you know what, because that makes all the sense in the world, that the fasting, because they fast. See, it's really weird because they kind of hide the truths in their traditions, because you still have even though they'll claim that, oh, Jesus got crucified on Friday, they still had a fast day for Wednesday because that's when Judas betrayed him. But that points back to a Wednesday crucifixion, because Judas betrayed him on Wednesday, and then he got crucified.
Well, you don't get 3 days. You don't get 3 nights from Friday to even if you go with the partial day equals
cool.
day view, you don't get 3 nights. So
that's really cool.
Yeah, I still believe that. Yeah.
Oh, so, that's awesome.
To sum it up, though, thank you for your testimony that the title is relevant, because I think what just happened between you and me is exactly what I was hoping would happen. I've acknowledged some true arguments on your side of the aisle, and I've acknowledged some of the bad arguments on my side of the aisle. And I feel like you've also, in agreeing with me about the broader sense of the word Easter, have come a little bit towards me. And that's what I love, is that at the meeting of the minds, if we're honest with each other, we can give ground to one another, say, hey, that's a good argument. Hey, that's a good argument. And I still walk away believing my King James Bible and the word Easter, and you still walk away believing whatever version that you use. But to be clear for the audience, I defend the use of the word Easter, but it is not, but the classical KJVO defense of the word Easter is mistaken. It's wrong. It is not a pagan holiday. That's not the defense to take. It is not just being distinguished from the Passover. It is being identified with the Passover. And you can make that identification if you first understand that it is not a pagan holiday. All that they're doing, the King James Bible translators were conveying that by the word Easter, that the entire feast of the Passover was not yet expired, and Herod was waiting for that to end so he can move on with slaying Peter.
All right.
All right.
You know,
I got to go eat before my wife gets upset.
All right, I'll let you go, man. It's good talking to you, man. It's like you helped me out a lot. I'm glad you also fixed me about that word, those, because I didn't know, like in Hebrew you could use singular words, like 2000 year. I didn't know you could do that in Hebrew.
Just with numbers over 10.
Yeah,
just with numbers over 10.
Plural and stuff. Plural for days and stuff like that. So thank you very much, because I don't want to use that argument with Seventh-day Adventists and things like that against them. So all right, thanks a lot, man. All
right, Chris. God bless you. All right, guys. God bless you all. Love you all. If you feel I've earned your support, check out the links in the description for the Council of Might Seminary, for support of the channel. Keep me your prayers. And as always, if you can, try to find a church, plug into the church. Remember, you're either called to be a pastor or to help a pastor. God bless you guys. Love you all. Oh, happy Easter.